question, which is that in the chapter where we talk about fiscal policy, I talk about the fact that governments often use budget deficits or grant budget deficits to stimulate the economy during recessions. And the aim, of course, is to increase GDP, create employment. But we know that such deficits may also add to inflationary pressures, that there's often a trade-off between inflation and unemployment. And again, you've done pioneering work in this area. So do you want to tell us a little bit more about this idea of there being a trade-off between inflation and unemployment?
Yes, so it was one of the old ideas that's been around 100 years, coming from one of the most famous economists that ever lived, John Maynard Keynes, this idea that if you're in a Great Depression, which occurred in the world in 1929, or more recently, the global financial crisis, the pandemic, there's a significant drop in GDP, rise in unemployment. The idea of Keynes was that this is a time maybe governments could spend more, borrow more. We also see in the newspaper our central bank was cutting interest rates. And the idea is maybe that's a way to avoid very costly, psychologically costly unemployment. Maybe that's a way to boost demand. And we've seen this play out just in the last few years in this country, the wage subsidy scheme in New Zealand. And that was nearly entirely financed by borrowing. So on the good side, you may have more unemployment, but on the bad side, it may generate more inflation because you're encouraging people to spend their money. That trade-off between unemployment and inflation was pioneered by probably the most famous New Zealand economist who ever lived, called Phillips, and it was called the Phillips curve trade-off. Now, where this work on happiness comes in is that there is still great controversy, and you see it in the newspapers still to this very day in New Zealand. Was it worthwhile for the government to borrow and spend so much? Should the Reserve Bank have cut interest rates down to almost nothing, done quantitative easing, printed $50 billion? Because we've actually been left with quite high inflation the last several years in this country. Now, whether that was worthwhile depends vitally on the costs of inflation compared to the costs of unemployment. So our government and central banks say they did a good thing because they kept unemployment quite low, and unemployment's very costly. There's another group of people who think that because inflation went up, the costs of inflation may have outweighed the costs of higher unemployment. A lot of people think that inflation has hurt us greatly as well. And there's quite a battle between these two groups of people, one who think unemployment's the most important thing to avoid, and the other who think inflation is. So you can actually try to find out what are the costs of these two of the main, most important macro variables, inflation and unemployment, through these surveys of happiness. You can correlate people's happiness with inflation and unemployment, and you can see how much does a 1% increase in inflation hurt people compared with a 1% unemployment, a 1% rise in unemployment. So that's a way these surveys can be brought to try to address this sort of question. And it's still controversial, again, like the long run effect of GDP, and you'll see that the debates are still rumbling on. And to this day, the Reserve Bank claims it was justified in creating this inflation and hurting people through bringing up interest rates to bring inflation down. But another group of people say it was a mistake as to what they did. So it all depends on the costs of those two variables.